Welcome back to J300 and Thomas World Headquarters here. Today's lecture is about notes on color. We're going to talk about all different facets of color today. Some of the things that you think you know about color, hopefully we will kind of prove them wrong, and we'll teach you some new things about color on top of that. So today's notes on color. So a lot of this lecture is inspired by a lecture that I heard a few years ago online. It is called Theories and Harmonies of Color by Stefan Baril. And I've used to just play his lecture in class because it was so useful and so well done. But the hardest part was that Stefan Baril has a very thick French accent, and it was hard to hear him over the speakers. So I kind of repackaged this, added some stuff of my own, but all credit here to Stefan Baril. It's a really good lecture, and it's linked in your slides that are sitting on Blackboard for you as well. So let's dive into some of what Stefan and I have to say here. So the lecture today is going to argue that color has all different kinds of significance and meaning. And so I'm going to kind of break it into chunks here in terms of different ways that we can find meaning in color. So the first way that we can find meaning in color is that I think all know that color has certain emotional meanings for us, that we associate different colors with different moods and different emotions. So, this cover of this WebMD magazine is trying to have a particular emotion for you. It's trying to be calming, it's trying to be pleasant, it's trying to be safe, and all of those emotions come through with the choices that they make here, right? Whereas this coverage from a magazine is trying to have a totally different emotion. It's trying to be intense, and it's trying to be muscular, and it's trying to be in some ways aggressive too. And so the use of color there is supposed to bring across that emotional meaning, right? We also know that color has symbolic meaning, right? And symbolic and emotional, we might find those as being similar words, but I think that we know them as being different, right? The idea that emotion is that it's tapping into something that we feel. Symbolic is meaning that we see that color and we associate it with something else. And so color has symbolic meaning. For instance, the idea of the rainbow is certainly something that we attach to the LGBTQ rights movement. And so when we see that, we immediately make that kind of association, right? And this little color wheel here has all of those different associations in mind. Some of these are a little bit, yes, emotional, right? But words like balance and harmony, those aren't necessarily emotional words as much as they are symbolic words. And so when we see a particular color, we oftentimes associate it with something that's tangible without even seeing that tangible thing, right? The other thing that we should know, and this is very important for those of us who are trying to communicate across many different cultures, is that color has cultural meaning, right? Is that it doesn't just have emotional and symbolic meaning, but that symbolic meaning is oftentimes tied to the culture of the person who is looking at your color expression, right? So we, in Western cultures, we see a bright, shiny yellow, and we think, oh, it is all about sunny and happiness and light, and maybe even a kind of shallow happiness, right? Not like a deep happiness, but a kind of silly happiness, right? Whereas in Eastern cultures, yellow and kind of the orange associated with yellow, they have a very high spiritual meaning, right? It's not this kind of silly happiness, but instead it has that kind of association. So we, as designers, we need to be sure to know our audience, right? We need to be sure that we know who we're communicating with and what kind of associations yellow would have with those audiences, right? So speaking of yellow, this is just one little tangent to go off on here. This is a little random color tip, is that we should be really, really careful when we use yellow, not just because of the cultural meanings from the previous slide, but that yellow is a very delicate color to work with. For instance, if you see at the top above the sprint symbol there, there is the word yellow, and you might even pass it by or kind of pass it by on purpose because it kind of vibrates in my eyes, right? And it's really uncomfortable in some ways to look at, and it's not very visible in some ways too. So oftentimes when we use yellow, we want to play it against some sort of a dark background, and so that's why we see the Sprint corporate logo as being a yellow on top of a black, and that works much more effectively here, right? we're going to continue talking about yellow, but talk about it in terms of this, and that is that color has a fashion and a timely meaning to it, right? That we associate different colors at different moments with different things, and some colors become very much in vogue or in fashion, and we see them run through our culture as being incredibly popular at a time, and then they'll kind of recede to being much less popular. I bring up yellow again here because yellow used to be one of these colors. This particular highlighter yellow back 10 years ago was everywhere. We used to go ahead and use this yellow to highlight tons of things within design spreads, and it's very much kind of receded from being that kind of a use. I used to use it a lot for my nonprofit because one of our colors was yellow. Now I use it a lot less because it's not very much in fashion. So who cares about this fashion, right? Who's consumed with it? The company that's consumed with it most of all is a company called Pantone, right? So let's talk a little bit about Pantone. You might have seen Pantone most visibly when you see a color swatch system like this, right? Now, let's separate this from what you would see if you went to Lowe's or Home Depot and tried to pick out, some Benjamin Moore paint while you're at home redecorating your house, right? And that is a different kind of color system. This color system here is used to choose color for printed material. So in your notes, I would put that probably first and foremost, is that Pantone is useful for showing what printed materials are going to look like, not for looking at what painted walls are going to look like. These swatch books that you see down at the lower right hand side here, these swatch books are really helpful to see what your color would look like if it was going to be used in a particular way, right? So if you were going to use a particular color, you would check this swatch book to see how it would look when it's printed. These swatch books aren't cheap, and we actually have to throw them away pretty often, and the reason is because they fade, right? We try to keep them in a drawer as much as we can and out of light because the color will change as they're faded by sunlight, right? So all of these kind of colors have an expression, and the expression is PMS. So if you look at the KU primary and secondary color palette here, right, you'll see that underneath the KU blue here, it says PMS 293. That tells you that when you go to this color matching book, if you went and found PMS 293, it would be the exact same blue that you see in printed KU materials. This is really useful if you want to make sure that the color blue that is on one printer that's in one part of the country and the color blue that's on a printer in another part of the country, that they're exactly matching, because Pantone makes sure of that. They go ahead and provide those colors to printers, right? The other thing that Pantone is really useful for is this idea of fashionable colors, right? Because they are kind of the color people, they want to go ahead and celebrate what color is and what color is in fashion right now. Every year they go ahead and they create a color of the year. So back in 2013, if we can remember back 7 years ago, right? It was this emerald green. And if you think back to your wardrobe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, you might think, oh, yeah, I remember that sweatshirt or that pair of pants or something like that that you had, and that is the emerald green color that likely was made in vogue by Pantone. You can see all of the different consumer products that follow these kind of trends and follow what is the color of the year. Over the course of the last 12 years, you can see even more of these colors. You can see the phase that Pantone went through from 2008 to 2013. You can see that it is these very, very vibrant colors. They're all over the color wheel, but they're very vibrant and saturated colors. And you'll see that starts changing over the last few years, right? 2014 certainly followed that trend. We used Radiant Orchid, right? So it was this very kind of lavender purple color that was their color of the year. And again, Pantone's job is to make us all believe that this is the color of the moment and to use tons of it, right? So they'll show us what a pumpkin looks like in a Radiant Orchid. They will show us what a set of books looks like in a bunch of colors that are kind of analogous to Radiant Orchid, right? They'll even show us what wardrobe or fashion shoots would look like if we were totally obsessed with Radiant Orchid as well. And we can see this expression again all throughout the culture, and they start to even give us these ideas of not just how can we use Radiant Orchid, but how can we use accompanying colors to Radiant Orchid. They'll start giving us color systems, right? So this is a particular color system that they suggested for New York Fashion Week, right? You could go ahead and use Radiant Orchid with Royal Blue and so on to make up your color palette. What was our color 5 years ago in 2015? It was Marsala, right? And again, all kinds of consumer products, whether chairs or lamps or candelabras, we were making those out of Marsala as much as possible, right? And who was wearing Marsala? Well, everybody apparently was wearing Marsala, right? We see it all over the runways, we see it all over fashion again, and we see it in these photo shoots that Pantone puts together as well. Should we need any more help convincing ourselves that Marsala was the color of the moment, Pantone is going to put together some very awkward photo shoots where Guy is wearing Marsala apron and he's standing next to Lady and giving another lady the eye here. And thanks Pantone, thanks for telling us how Marsala makes us look here. And everybody follows Marsala, right? Whether we are Beyonce or T Swift, we're going to put ourselves in Marsala. 2016. What's it look like? It is not just one color in 2016. They give us two different complementary colors here. They give us Rose Quartz and Serenity. And again, if you think about all of the things in your life, all of the iPhone cases, all of the iPhones themselves, all of the things that are in your house, you probably can look around your room right now and find a couple of things that match this color system, right? So they suggest to us in 2016 that we should use all of these colors together, whether it's Rose Quartz or Serenity together. They show us how different companies are using them. They give us all kinds of color pairings and color systems to work with. 2017 is greenery, right? 2018 is ultraviolet. 2019, what did it look like? It was living coral, and this was following a lot of kind of naturalist design, the idea that we want to preserve this this dying ecosystem of the coral reef, right? They tell us exactly how to formulate that color and how to make it happen. They give us some color systems, not just one color system, which they're calling focal point here, but they give us a couple different color systems, right? They give us shimmering sunset, and we can use living coral to make up that part of that color system. They give us trippy, and they show us how living coral can be part of that color system as well, right? In 2020, just a few months ago, they released their color of the year for 2020. You can do a little home drum roll for this one, and that is that the color of 2020 is classic blue, right? Classic blue is going to again come in all of these different consumer products. And we are going to give us all kinds of different color harmonies that we can work with. So if we want to give the emotional appeal of ponder, well, ponder can include classic blue and snorkel. Again, kind of going back to the last year's color and the coral color that they were using. They're still kind of pulling this into the snorkel color scheme that includes this year's color of classic blue, and then they're also using it for things like desert twilight, right? Brands really care about this, right? They really care about how what kind of appeal these colors have to us. So if you can think about all of these different brands and what they're trying to signify, up at the top you have all of the colors, all of the brands that use black, and they are trying to look dramatic and sophisticated. So we can see Prada, Kors, Gucci, Chanel, all of those up there. Well, who is using blue, which is trustworthy and secure? Well, that makes sense. It's brands like the Gap who want to make clothes that they feel like are, reasonable and secure and are trustworthy and that they're not going to fall apart on you. Ford wants to be a reliable car brand, right? But then if we go all the way down the list, we can find something much more different, right? We can find something like the orange color scheme, which is energetic and vibrant, right? We're looking at things like Nickelodeon and Fanta. They want to be energetic. They don't want to be trustworthy and secure. We don't want our soft drink to be trustworthy and secure, so orange is a much better color for something like that, right? The next thing that I'm going to argue, in addition to the idea that color has this emotional appeal, that it has fashion appeal, that it has cultural expression, that it has all of those different things, is the idea that color has scientific expression. And this is going to be kind of the majority of the rest of the lecture here, is the idea of how to think about color in a scientific way. And color has scientific expression in this fact. Our eye sees color in a particular way. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but it's worth saying. How many of you have been talking to somebody at some point and you've said, what if the red that I see is actually blue to you? And what if the blue that you see is actually orange to me? And what if the orange that I see is actually what my cousin sees as yellow? Oh my gosh, what if there was such a world? What we're going to talk about for the next few slides is the fact that that's not the case, is that color has a scientific expression that isn't that kind of stoner theory about color of what if, right? What if that was the case, right? So what are we talking about here? What we're talking about here is the idea that our eye, yes, that's a cross-section of an eye. Sorry if you took journalism to get away from dissecting things, but this will be our one little biological, anatomical look at the eye really quickly. Our eye has two different receptors in it, right? One of them is called the cone, and that governs and provides color vision. And one of those is the rod, which provides monochromatic vision as well. So as light enters our eye, we perceive things because of that rod and cone. So this next slide here is a place to pause. I'm going to pause here for a moment and give you a chance to go ahead and navigate back to Blackboard. There's a YouTube video there that I think is really, really helpful to seeing what I'd like you to see. Make sure to go watch that video. I'm going to pause for a moment here and give you a chance to do that. So that video there argues and provides lots of proof to the idea that we see color in a scientific way, right? So let's break down some other ideas about how we see color. We're going to define two different ways of thinking about color. One is called additive color, and the other one is called subtractive color. Now, I think that it's worth putting in your notes here a little exclamation point or star, because these terms actually kind of don't make sense in the way that we normally think about the words additive and subtractive. So let's break that down a little bit. When we talk about additive color, we're talking about projected light. Okay? Projected light, meaning that on this slide here you see a projected green, projected blue, and projected red light being shined on this brick wall. And when we do that, when we shine all of those colors together, what we get when we overlap all of them is we get white, right? So that is what happens when we overlap projected light colors. This can be shown in a color wheel like this, or it can be shown as an image like I did right there. So put a line in your notes. That is additive color. Additive color is light projected, right? So where do we see this in our lives? We see this in the monitor that you're looking at, the cell phone screen that you would look at, the projector if we were back at KU and looking at it on a projector. All of those things are projected additive light. Okay. The other kind of light that there is what we call subtractive color. Okay. Now, subtractive color is this. It is pigment. pigment meaning ink on the page, meaning crayons on the page, meaning anything that is actually put on the page. That is the idea of subtractive color. Now when we do this, and we've all had the experience of doing this, right? When you go ahead and scribble on a piece of paper with a yellow crayon and then a blue crayon and then a green crayon and then a magenta crayon, sooner or later those colors become nearly black because you keep adding all different kinds of colors to it. And that's why I think this term is a little bit misleading, because we're adding actual pigment to the colors, but this kind of color system is called a subtractive color, right? So let's look at what these two look like next to each other. Additive on the left, projected light; subtractive on the right, pigment. And when they overlap, they do different things. When additive overlaps, it creates white, and when subtractive overlaps, it becomes black. The thing that we should know about this is that these color schemes are named based on the colors that happen within them. So on the left-hand side, the additive color scheme is red at the top, blue on the right, green on the left. It is RGB, for red, green, blue. On the right-hand side is CMYK. CMYK standing for cyan, which is the blue at the bottom left of that color scheme, the yellow at the top, the magenta at the right. So CMY. What does the K stand for? The K stands for black, right? We don't call it B, because if we did, it might be mistaken for blue. So CMYK color scheme. CMYK color scheme is familiar to any of you who worked on publications earlier than now and printed in color, because anytime that we print something, it's going to show up as a CMYK color scheme, right? So when we go ahead and print this picture on the left-hand side of the screen, it's actually made up of 4 different color schemes, right? It's actually made up of 4 different colors. It's made up of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. We can tell from looking at the wall of the background of this photo that there's a ton of cyan in it, right? There's a lot of light blue that's happening. So on that plate, that C plate that you're looking at there, there's tons and tons of blue on it, right? And so that's why that image appears that way. I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide here. And on this slide here, you're going to see another video that is linked on your Blackboard page. I'm going to pause again here and give you a chance just to go take a look at it in a moment. When you do, what I'm trying to show with this video, it's a little bit too long, but what I'm trying to show you is that when a piece of paper gets printed through a printing press, it gets printed by a cyan printer, and then a yellow printer, and then a magenta printer, and then a black printer. And we know this because anytime that you've replaced the print cartridges in your home printer, you have 4 different cartridges, and they are C, M, Y, and K. And that's why, that's another way that we know that CMYK exists in the world. So go watch that video. I'll pause here for a second. CMYK printers need to make sure that those plates hit in a particular way, that they're very, very exact. So anytime that you pick up a consumer good that has printing on it, take a look and try to find this little target scheme that you might find on any one of them. These are called registration marks, and registration marks are meant to make sure that that blue plate hits exactly where it should, and the cyan one does, and the magenta one does, and the black one does, so that they don't come what's called out of register. Many of you have seen newspapers or magazines or consumer goods that have been printed out of register, and they look like this, right? The yellow one is too high and to the left. The magenta one is too high and to the right. The cyan one is too low and to the right. And the black one looks like it's pretty dead on, right? And so all of those need to be brought into register a little bit more. It doesn't matter if you are looking at a box of Cheez-Its, it has a registration mark on it, or a Frosted Flakes box, it has a registration mark on it as well. All of those things have registration marks. You can also see on the side of those boxes how they are showing their Pantone colors, right? Because the Frosted Flakes box cares incredibly about the the particular blue that's being used. And so there is a blue circle on the bottom right of that Frosted Flakes lid that is showing that Pantone color, so that the printing press people know that they're getting exactly the kind of blue that they're looking for here, right? So it has CMYK, but then it has those two Pantone colors of orange and blue, because they want to be exactly sure that those orange and blue show up correctly, right? So CMYK, printed materials. Okay. On the other side, we have RGB, right? When we look at RGB here, we're going to see that we're going to start developing complementary colors and opposite colors here, right? So across from blue, we have yellow. Across from red, we have this blue, and across from green, we have this pink color. Now look at this. If we go back and look at those again, there's the yellow from CMYK. There is the cyan from CMYK, and there's the magenta from CMYK as well. So these are opposite color systems, and when we look at them in more detail, we notice that they are actually mirroring each other a little bit as well. This is one of the ways that we know, again, stoner dorm guy, that your green is not my red, because we are actually seeing different wavelengths of colors, and they appear differently, right? The other thing that we should know about color is that there is a mental aspect of color vision, right? And that is that it doesn't just matter what color we're looking at. We can be influenced by the surrounding colors that are around it, right? We may think, oh, that blue looks like a particular blue, but our mind may be fooled by the surrounding colors. It may be fooled based on what we looked at most recently. So our brain can be tricked into seeing colors in a different way. Now, most of these shifts are subtle, right? We see a blue and we think it is a particular shade of blue, but it's just a percentage blue off from what we think we're seeing. Some of these can be really stark shifts, as we'll talk about in another lecture here, right? So when we're going to try to compare blues, we need to compare them side by side right after one another if we want to know that we're making a valid comparison, right? So if we look at these two squares of blue, we are going to see, yes, those are absolutely positively the same blue. There's no doubt about that, right? But when we take those exact same blues and we surround them with different colors, it influences what those blues look like. For instance, to me, when I surround this green, this blue square on the left with green, I experience that blue as being deeper and more saturated than the blue square on the right that's surrounded by orange. Now, your experience may be different in terms of how you see each one of those, but I see that right-hand blue square as being more vibrant. But the reality is that it's still the same square. It's just that it's surrounded with a different color, right? We can see this in some optical illusions here, and some of these are just really fun to play with, and they basically are proving the point that your brain is influenced by surrounding colors. So it is clear from this illustration here that A is much darker than B. I think we all can agree that that is the case, right? The problem is they're not. It is an optical illusion here. If we eliminate all of the surrounding things that are happening there, and we just go ahead and put a gray line next to each of those, they are very, very similar now. Now we're thinking, wow, those actually don't look all that different. And then if we take out all of the surrounding colors and we just look at A and B as squares without looking at all of the surrounding stuff, then we see that they're actually the same color. Yep, that is the case. I'll flip through them again, right? A looks incredibly, a lot darker than B. Now they're starting to look a lot closer, and now they look exactly the same because they actually are the same. It's just that our eye has been tricked by the surrounding colors, right? This is another one of those examples here, right? The top portion of this, beveled shape looks much, much darker than the bottom portion of the beveled shape. But what happens when we take away the optical illusion portion of it in the middle, we actually notice that they are the same thing. You can prove this to yourself when I go back to this slide. If you just shield that middle portion of the design there, you'll see how similar and indeed how identical those colors are on the top and the bottom of this form. When we go ahead and blend them together and put something in the middle that is the same color, we notice that they actually are the same color. Yep, that's a little bit of an optical illusion, that's fine, but it proves the point that surrounding colors influence what we see. So we need to pay attention to this as designers and not just call blue blue, but to call blue a particular kind of blue when it's surrounded by everything else, right? So what is this color wheel all about here? This color wheel is meant to illustrate some color relationships here, right? And you've talked about these since you were probably in kindergarten, right? In the middle of this color wheel, this is called Itten's color wheel, right? And this color wheel represents the primary colors in the middle, blue, yellow, and red. And then as we move out from there, we start seeing other kinds of colors. We start seeing yellow and red being blended to make orange, and red and blue being blended to make purple, and so on. Those are called the secondary colors, right? And then as we move to the outside, we start seeing the tertiary colors, right? The colors that are blended from the primary and secondary colors to make yet even more colors. Let's talk about color vocabulary as well. Color vocabulary is a way that we can talk about color in a much more precise way. And what we'll be talking about here for a couple of these slides is how we generally talk about color in kind of an incorrect way in terms of how designers talk about it, right? So the first one is the word hue. Hue is when we talk about specific colors that we are referring to in terms of, their kind of brand name, if you will. The third bullet point here is the color name associated with a color. So blue is a hue, orange is a hue, yellow is a hue. All of those, as we would call them, we generally call them in daily conversation, we call them different colors, but they're actually different hues. So that's what the first color vocabulary bullet point that we need to think about too, right? And the second bullet point points out the idea that when we talk about these, we're talking about 12 basic colors on the color wheel, and that's why, crayons and markers, they make a certain number of hues within a set of those colors, right? So let's look at this color wheel expression too. There are so many different ways that we can represent colors on the color wheel, but this one points out that that pie slice of orange is a hue. The one next to it, which is red, is a different hue, and then violet next to that is a different hue, and so on, right? So those are different hues. The second kind of color vocabulary, and one that we'll talk about very often, is the idea of saturation. Saturation is the relative dullness or brightness of a color. So if you look at a color and you think, wow, it took a lot of ink to put that on the page, it almost looks like it's still wet on the page. That is saturation. So, a stop sign is something that has an incredible amount of saturation to it because it is a red that is very, very vivid and intense. We can look at a slide like this and see all of these different blues here, and we can see that they go from incredibly dry looking on the right to incredible saturation on the left-hand side. If we look at an expression of red, we can see that on the right-hand side, this would be that stop sign, cherry red, and on the left-hand side, it would be this much drier, almost pink expression of red. That's saturation. The next one here is value. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you this just out of fairness, that value and saturation are so close and they are so hard to distinguish for many people that it would be really unfair of me to put a question on your test to say, what has been changed from this color to this color? Has saturation changed or has value changed? That's not a fair question, but it is important to know that instead of talking about lightness, wetness, or perceived wetness, now we're talking about lightness or darkness of a color. A lot of Adobe applications such as Photoshop and InDesign, when you're naming colors, will refer to this as lightness, right? So they'll talk about value or lightness as being interchangeable. So just know that that is a way of thinking about value is as lightness. So if we look at this slide here, you'll see that on the left-hand side are colors that have very, very low value. And as we move across to the right, those values increase from one step to another. Same thing here if we move from the value at the bottom here up to the value at the top here, the amount of black that's in them, that's an expression of that as well. We are very, very comfortable talking about the idea of coolness or warmness of a color, and that is, of course, color temperature. So that's an easy way to remember it because the temperature is cool or the temperature is warm. When we think about color temperatures, it's nice that it's actually measured in degrees. So if you look at that left-hand column right there, you can see that it's measured in degrees of Kelvin, Kelvin, degrees of Kelvin. And so different colors have different color temperatures when we look at them in that way. So if I was going to be taking pictures with a DSLR camera, or if I was going to be taking video with a sophisticated video camera, I would be able to set my white balance settings, and many of you have worked with this before. And if it was a cloudy day or if I was in the shade, I would use one kind of white balance setting, whereas if I was taking pictures by a lamplight, then I would use a different kind of color setting altogether. And those color settings are all measured in degrees of Kelvin. We know this from being out in the world all the time, and you know this by actually looking at me when I'm lecturing. Right now I'm sitting in some nice warm sunlight that's coming in from the window beside me, and that's going to give me and every color that's associated with me a much different look than you saw a couple days ago when it was a different kind of light that was illuminating me as well. We generally divide the color wheel into two different segments, warm and cold, and warm colors start with orange and work their way around, and cool colors start with kind of turquoise blue and work their way around to the other side. Why do we care about this? Why should we care about color temperature and naming colors in a particular way? Well, one of the reasons that we should care about it is that they have different uses, warm colors and cool colors. Generally, we would say that warm colors and cool colors differ in this respect. Cool colors retreat. They appear to head away from us. They appear to be passive. They appear to not be active at all. They appear to be receding from the viewer. What happens when we look at warm colors? They appear to be advancing towards us, right? They appear to be more aggressive. They appear to be approaching us. And these are things that we can use when we're designing our resume, when we're designing our infographic, when we're designing business cards, when we're designing our publication. If we want something to advance towards us, we use warm colors. If we want something to sink into the background, then we use red colors. Why are so many brand logos, whether it be Target from our last lecture or any other brand like Coca-Cola, use red? Because they advance out and kind of grab our attention in this way. We can use this little slide to illustrate how we know this is true. If I look at the slide, the way I experience it at least, is that square in the bottom left is calling for my attention. And you might say, well, maybe it's the squareness of that shape. Well, if I do this, I'm much more likely to care about the red circle. And if I do this, then I'm much more likely to care about the red triangle. So whichever one of these we are looking at, we are going to go ahead and pay attention to the red, the warm color, most likely. that takes us into the idea of concepts of harmony. So how do we choose colors that go together? I'm looking at my resume. It's a blank page right now. I don't really know what to do to make these colors make sense together. So let's talk about some different color harmonies and the different concepts of harmony and what they each mean to us. So the first one is the idea of monochromatic, meaning one chroma, meaning one color that's being expressed from lightness to darkness. So if we look at the left-hand image here, right, we see the idea of black being expressed from light black to dark black and every gray shade in between. When we think about a sepia toned image, for those photographers who've played with sepia tone, we can look at it as being kind of that rust colored brown, and it goes from dark expression of that rust colored brown to light expression of that dark colored brown, and that's one way to look at monochromatic, right? Some artists like Picasso and others have gone through periods where they just work with one chroma, where they just work in one color, and they take their paint and use it from its lightest expression to its darkest expression. Those are monochromatic color schemes, right? So this is an illustration of how that looks in terms of another color wheel. Again, there's no one color wheel that we can say is correct, right? There you can illustrate many different things, but this illustrates the idea that we are just working in one slice of that pie, but we're working on it from its lightest to its darkest, and we're playing with all different variations of that, right? What about complementary colors? What are we talking about when we talk about that? Well, this is a lot of bullet points for something that you probably felt like you understood completely from kindergarten, talking about complementary colors. When we talk about complementary colors, we talk about colors that cancel each other, right? That they're opposite colors on the color wheel, right? If we're talking about it in terms of subtractive color, when we're going ahead and projecting color, right? Then we need to think about it as subtractive color, like when we're talking about ink. I fooled myself there. When we put these two colors together, then we are going to go ahead and make a really, really deep, almost black-gray color. When we're talking about additive color, like light, when we combine these two together, we're going to go ahead and get white, right? These are very common colors that we see every day out in the world. I'm looking around my room here, and I'm seeing tons and tons of complementary colors, right? We see these all the time, right? Red and green are complementary colors, and we obviously see this with all kinds of imagery, especially surrounding the holiday of Christmas, right? We also see tons and tons of pro sports teams that play with complementary colors. Why do we see them playing with complementary colors? Because complementary colors are so vibrant and aggressive that they make sense as sports brands. So when we see red and green, we see them played together for brands like the New Jersey Devils or the Milwaukee Bucks, right? So what about other complementary colors? Well, orange and blue are complementary colors as well. They sit across from one another on the color wheel, and so we see all kinds of imagery that plays with orange and blue. So think to yourself, what are some pro sports teams that play with orange and blue as their colors? See how many of them you can name in your head here. When I think about orange and blue, I think about brands like the New York Knicks. I think about the New York Mets. I think about Boise State and their incredible blue field. I think about the Illinois basketball team, the Illini, and all of their orange and blue as well. What's another pairing of complementary colors? We think about yellow and purple, right? And what are some brands, what are some teams that play with the idea of orange and purple? Well, the most famous, of course, is the Los Angeles Lakers, or we could even think about the Minnesota Vikings, right? So these are brands that play on complementary colors, and we see this all over the sports world. Now, one fun little bit of trivia that proves to you that complementary colors exist as part of scientific expression is this little optical illusion that I'm going to ask you to do for a moment here. So I'm going to show you a slide in a moment here. When I do, I want you to stare at the red dot in the middle of that slide, and I'm just going to hold that slide for a few moments, okay? So here we are. Just stare at that red dot right in the middle of the slide. And what you're looking at is obviously the image of the American flag. And in a moment here, I'm going to take away that image of the American flag and notice what happens in your vision when I do that. So staring at the middle, staring at the red dot, and here we go. I'm going to take it away. Hopefully what you saw is that your eyes flipped over. Even though it was only looking at this white slide here, it projected, your eyes were projecting, or your mind was perceiving that the American flag was still there in colors that were actually even more true than this image right here. So let's do it one more time just because it's trippy and fun. Stare right at the middle of the red dot there, and I'll hold it for 10 seconds. And there you saw the ghosting image of the American flag popping up again. So what's happening when we're doing this? Our mind is flooding this area with the opposite color of what we're doing. It's saying, wow, that is a lot of black that's happening on those stripes. So I am going to actually be kind of buffering that perception and putting white there. And so when it flips over to an image that is nothing, your eye is actually kind of, your mind is perceiving the opposite color. So what's the opposite of this blue? It's red. What's the opposite of this orange? It is blue. And that's how we know that complementary colors exist as a natural scientific phenomenon. What are some other color relationships besides complementary? Well, complementary is straight across the color wheel from one another. Triad colors are three colors that sit across the color wheel from one another. Not directly across, right? But they are colors that sit pretty far away from one another on the color wheel. So what is the characteristic of a triad color system? What they have is a lot of contrast still, because those colors are very far away from one another still, but they are not as far away as the complementary colors. And another thing that this allows us to do is it allows us to have more balance, right? When you just have two colors that are across the color wheel from one another, it's really easy to kind of have those teeter off and fall to one side or another. This is going to give us, just like a triangle does with geometry, it's going to give us more balance here. So that's one of the reasons to use a triad color scheme. This is one triad color scheme. Here's another triad color scheme, and here's yet another triad color scheme. Those triad color schemes can kind of rotate as they need to, so that you can choose three colors that are far away from one another. The tetrad color scheme, just like we would expect, is now called a double complementary. So now we're finding two complementary colors, in this case yellow-green and red-violet. Those are straight across the color wheel from one another, and we are putting them with two other colors that are straight across the color wheel from one another, orange and blue. All four of these then are going to be tetrad colors to one another. This is a tough one, right? Because now you have two warring pairs of colors that are trying to oppose one another, and we need to try to figure out which one of these is going to be dominant. One of them will need to be dominant, otherwise all of them are going to be bickering for the audience's attention, right? So tetrad colors can be used, and again, we can choose them in different ways. We don't have to choose just one. The other way that we can think about colors is as analogous colors. Analogous colors are sometimes called neighboring colors, right? So neighboring colors can be right adjacent to one another on the color wheel. So the color wheel might choose red as the central color, and then red-violet to one side and red-orange to the other side, and that's going to create an analogous color scheme. These are these are seen as much more nuanced color schemes, and they are very similar to monochromatic because we're choosing colors that aren't huge contrasts to one another. This can be very useful for your resume assignment. You probably saw some resumes already that were laid out with this idea of not huge contrasting colors, but instead neighboring colors in this way. Here's another one that plays on yellow as the central color scheme here. So what will I ask you to do with this knowledge of colors? I'm going to ask you to do a couple things. One, of course, apply it to your resume assignment. And the other thing is, on the exam, I will ask you to identify what kind of a color relationship is working here. So if you look at this color scheme right here, you should be able to identify that there's a lot of red that's being used here. There is a lot of this orange that's being used here, and there's a lot of this blue that's being used here. So if you went ahead and diagrammed this on the color wheel, you would be able to see that there are many, many different pages that are working off of this same color scheme, red, and then a little bit of orange, yellow, and then some blue. All of these pages are playing with that. So what does that all add up to? Well, it all adds up to this. It is a triad color scheme because those are the three colors that we're working with, right? What kind of color relationship is this? We see a lot of yellow on this page. We see a lot of blue on this page in the the border color as well. And so that is kind of a complementary color scheme while not being strictly complementary. It's not straight across the color wheel, but it is very close to being straight across the color wheel. We could look at this one as well, and we would see that it plays with this idea of blue, and it also plays with the idea of yellow as well, and when we play with that, it is a complementary color scheme as well. What about this one? What kind of color scheme would you call this? Well, if I look at this, I see a lot of neighboring colors that are being played with here. I see a lot of this red-orange. I see a lot of red. I see a lot of orange. So this would be a neighboring or analogous color scheme that's played with here. Another example here, red, orange, light blue. What does that look like? It's another one of these triad color schemes, although it's not evenly distributed among all of those. What do we see here? I see blue, I see yellow, I see a little bit of orange as well. When we map that out, look at how this is playing with this idea of a tetrad color scheme. It's not exactly square like the other ones have been, and notice how that makes it a little bit more sophisticated as well. I look at this one here and I see all kinds of shades that are neighboring on the color wheel. I look at this color wheel and I say, what sort of colors are we working with? I see a lot of neighboring or analogous colors on here. Again, this is a fair game thing for me to play on your exam, and it's also something that I hope that you'll play with for your infographic and your resume. What kind of color scheme do you want to use, right? The final concept inside of color that I wanted to introduce to you is the idea of atmospheric perspective. This is something that we know just intuitively as being humans out in the world, but it's something that we can do to add to our designs when we're actually producing things, right? So if I look out my window right now, I see a bunch of grass, a bunch of beautiful grass sitting out in the yard, right? And the closest of that grass is very vivid. It's very nice and green. I fertilized my yard. I've done an excellent job. It is very nice and green. As I look further away, I see people's yards that are, maybe 100, 200 yards away. And those yards, not because they haven't been fertilized and not because they're not vibrant and green, those look less green than my yard. Well, why is that? The reason is because things that are closest to us are most vibrant, and things that are farthest away, even if they're the same color, are going to appear to be less saturated. We can look at an image like this, and things that are close to us here, although they don't look incredibly vivid and saturated, they certainly look more vivid and saturated than things that are very far away. Same thing with this image here. Those hills in the background, they likely have the same kind of trees and grasses on them as things that are up close here, but those trees and grasses that are close, they are much more saturated and much more vivid. Same thing with this image here. Off in the distance are a bunch of trees, and those trees look very, very different in color to what we're looking at here, right? So why does that matter? Why am I pointing that out when we're playing with something like page design? Well, we can do this as designers when we're playing with color. When you put color on the page, the things that you want to have the most attention to should have the most saturation. They will appear to be in the foreground of the page. They're not in the foreground of the page. They're not any closer to the viewer than anything else, but they can appear to be. So if we look at this page that we looked at earlier, right, the background up at the top of this page is yellow. Now we call it the background, but it's not really any farther away than anything else, but it appears to be because it is much less saturated than the red or the character who's juggling the soccer ball, or at the bottom of the page, the blue is so rich in its color, it's so saturated in its color that it seems to jump out and be in the foreground, whereas other things that are less saturated, they appear to fall away and be the background. And another example would be this page right here, where all of that stuff that appears to be background, it's not actually background. It's not any farther away from the viewer than anything else. It appears to be because it is less saturated. So if we look at a page like this, this is the kind of thing that I would like you to be able to identify and work with in your design. You should be able to say insightful things like, look at this analogous color scheme, right? It has lots of neighboring colors on the color wheel, and one of the reasons that it's doing that is because it's trying to be very, very sophisticated, and it's not trying to show off a lot of contrast. It's not trying to be an aggressive, CrossFit page. It's trying to be a very, very gentle page, right? It's about Thanksgiving dinner, and so it's supposed to be more subtle. Also, I noticed that the background, tan is using atmospheric perspective so that it appears that it's falling away from the viewer and that it's in the background. Whereas the background for less is more important to the audience, and so I'm going to give it more saturation and have it pop out along with the circular images at the top of the page. These would all be things that I think you could be expected to do when you work on your exam or on your resume, that you would apply these concepts and be able to identify them as well. That's it for notes on color. I'm going to go ahead and add one more small lecture onto the back of this week, which is going to be about a phenomenon with color that some of you are familiar with. I'll see you in that lecture in just a little bit.